The Australian War Memorial in the nation's capital, Canberra, sits opposite the country's parliament at the other end of Anzac Way. Thousands of people come here every year to study the history of Australia at war and to remember the nation's dead. They come to see this bronze figure and to pay homage to a man regarded by many as Australia's greatest military hero, John Simpson Kirkpatrick, the legendary man with the donkey. In the opening weeks of the Gallipoli campaign, he helped save the lives of more than 300 men. He's come to epitomise what Australians recognise as the Anzac spirit. This lifeboat, used to row men ashore on the morning of the landing, is a stark reminder of the human cost of war. For the people of Australia, the story of what happened at Anzac and the events on that distant strip of land still have great meaning today. The ultimate brutality of the fighting proved to the soldiers and the people back home that they could take anything that was dished out to them. For Australians, what happened at Gallipoli was more a victory than a defeat. It's significant that the nation should choose a simple private soldier as its greatest military hero, rather than a general or a politician. Strangely, there's been no official recognition of Simpson Kirkpatrick's bravery. But our story begins on the other side of the world, in the northeast of England, in the town of South Shields on the River Tyne. Sometime in the mid-1880s, Robert and Sarah Simpson Kirkpatrick moved here from Edinburgh. Robert was a ship's captain, working coastal steamers for the Edinburgh and London Steamship Company. Following a trip to Tyneside, he liked what he saw and decided to settle in South Shields. The couple moved into a terraced house in South Eldon Street, not far from the river. It was here that John Simpson Kirkpatrick was born in 1892. The community brought together the men employed in the town's two main industries, coal mining and ships. In 1900, infant mortality took the lives of many children. Of the 8 born to Sarah, Jack was the only one of 4 boys to survive, giving him a special place in his mother's affections. His younger sister Annie would remain a close friend and confidant. South Shields was a great place for a boy to grow up. There were games with his friends and of course the beach, for which Shields was justly proud.
It was probably a town of contrasts at that time. You had a great deal of poverty, especially in the old riverside area where it wasn't unusual to find 4, 5, 6 families perhaps sharing a tenemented house with a yard with a tap in and an outside toilet. But you also had an awful lot of prosperity as well. The town was predominantly a seafaring one. So you had a lot of master mariners, a lot of marine engineers, so you had quite well-to-do families as well. And then there was a middle ground where the families probably worked in the pits, in the shipyards, building and repairing ships, and in heavy engineering. I think he probably had the quite traditional family background of somebody born into his class in South Shields, again with not a great deal of money, enough to get by on but not enough for luxuries. His childhood was probably typical of a lot of children at that time, where you had the seafront and the parks and you could roam to your heart's content.
The beach was a magnet for young Jack. It was a passion he shared with many of the townspeople. It was somewhere to relax and escape from the grind of daily life. It was at the beach that Jack first encountered his beloved donkeys. During the summer months, Mr. George was one of the best-known figures on the beach. He recognised Jack's love for the animals and let him take the children for rides up and down the sands. This association was one that would stand Jack in good stead years later when he landed on another beach at Gallipoli. When he was 12, his father suffered a crippling accident. It changed the secure pattern of life that Jack had enjoyed. He now had to find a job to help with the family income. It was mainly due to his mother's influence that Jack avoided being sent to work in the pits. Coal mining was the major occupation for many young men in the northeast, and one which killed and maimed hundreds every year. As if to confirm her worst fears, the Durham coalfield was about to suffer one of the worst mining disasters in living memory. On the afternoon of February 16, 1909, the mine at West Stanley blew up. The explosion claimed the lives of 168 men and boys. Jack's mother vowed he would never go down the pit. At the age of 17 years and 7 months, one event was to change his life forever. In October 1909, his father died. Jack made the decision to follow in his footsteps and go to sea. As he walked to the customs house to sign up for work on the next available merchant ship, they were to be the first steps on his fateful journey. Jack worked aboard a freighter bound for North Africa and the Mediterranean. While he was away, he wrote home to his mother at least once a month.
I get up at 4:45 in the morning and make tea and toast for the second engineer, and you better have me own. I then work on till about 1:30 and then I have me afternoon nap. Oh, I have a pretty soft time of it. It's money for nowt. You won't have to worry about me anymore, for I'm as happy as a tinty.
During the next 2 years, he travelled far and wide, working as a stoker. It was in the engine room that he began to develop the strength that would stand him in such good stead at Gallipoli. Conditions aboard ship were often of the most basic kind. It was while travelling aboard one of these ships, as it headed for Australia, that things finally became intolerable. Jack and 13 of his crewmates jumped ship on their arrival in Newcastle, New South Wales.
I stopped by her for a fortnight in Newcastle until the 13th. I didn't want to leave before the 12th of May, because if I had, the skipper would have wired home and stopped the half pay which was due. So, on the 13th, there were 14 of us firemen and sailors cleared out.
For the next 4 years, Jack travelled around Australia trying a variety of jobs. He turned his hand to sugarcane cutting, working with cattle, even mining. Anything to earn a quid. But it was the sea that took first place in his affections. He could make more money and enjoy the company of his shipmates. Having spent so long away from England, Jack began to feel homesick and wrote to his mother.
I'm going to try to hang this ship down for another 8 or 9 months, and then I'm coming home. So see and start looking your best for next year, for I'm sick and tired of knocking about out here. You know the old saying that every bird likes its own nest best, so you can look out for us next year, even if I land home broke.
When Simpson Kirkpatrick steamed into Fremantle Harbour here in Western Australia, he'd already been in the country for 4 years. It was here that he first learnt of the war in Europe, and he hatched a plan hoping to get a free trip back to the mother country and the family which he missed. He jumped ship for the second time and signed up with the Australian Army, which at that stage was bound for France. Fate, however, had some other plans for John Simpson Kirkpatrick. Fearing that he might have trouble being accepted by the Army, having deserted from the Merchant Navy, he now changed his name, dropping the Kirkpatrick to become plain John Simpson. He enlisted in Perth on August the 23rd, 1914. Like many thousands of young Australians, Jack joined up for what he thought would be the Great Adventure. In 1914, the population of Australia numbered less than 5 million, the vast majority from Britain. On the day he enlisted, Jack was sent to Black Boy Hill Camp, 15 miles outside Perth. He was the 202nd man to join up. Before the war, this had been the site of an Aboriginal camp, but with the outbreak of hostilities, it was converted for use as a training camp by the Army. Today, it's the children of Greenmount Primary School who gather here to celebrate the spirit of Anzac and to commemorate those who passed through here on their way to war. This would become Jack's home for the next 4 months.
All of these years did the training right here on Black Boy Hill, and were all recognised for significant...
In August 1914, Black Boy Hill was a hive of activity as more raw recruits arrived. It remained in use as a training camp throughout the war. In all, some 32,000 men of the 1st Australian Imperial Force came here to learn the arts of war. They were taught how to use explosives and dig trenches that would protect them from enemy shellfire and bullets, and to develop their horsemanship. Many came from the outback and were already crack shots. Now they had the chance to test their skills with their mates. It was at this stage that men were selected for the field ambulance units. The medical officer who examined Jack Simpson noted his powerful physique and sent him to join the other mixed bunch of C-section 3rd Field Ambulance.
Simpson was clearly, from his working life, a strong man. He'd started work at a very young age. He'd gone to sea at the age of 17. He'd developed a good physique. He had to be strong. He was not a big man, and the image that we often have of the Anzacs is all 6 foot tall, dark, well-built men, which is untrue anyway. Simpson only stood 5 foot 8.5 inches. He weighed 12 stone. He was solid. He was strong. A laconic grin, which is always on his face in all these photographs, and a bit of a character. He was the man always playing a joke. One of our photographs in the memorial collections shows him training at Black Boy Hill Camp with a mate, and they've got hold of a skeleton, which has clearly been used for anatomical lessons when they're training them as ambulance men, and he stuck his slouch hat on the skeleton. Probably a typical act of irreverence that this man would have been known for amongst his mates.
This attitude is very much in the spirit of what Australians call a larrikin, a term used to describe someone at odds with authority.
A larrikin is a character peculiar to Australian culture, perhaps, someone who's admired for his irreverence and sometimes outspoken character. I suspect every mining camp, every work site, every ship, and probably every mess of soldiers has one of these characters who's perhaps a little bit of a card, who plays pranks, who's got a fund of stories, and is renowned for his probably disrespect for authority, casualness about the forms of correct dress and authority. And Simpson was definitely one of these characters. You can see it in the photographs we have of him. He's got this ready grin, and usually his clothing is unconventional, unorthodox. He wears his forage cap sideways on his head in a couple of the photographs. He's got a relaxed and casual air about him that's typical of what we know as the Australian larrikin type.
This carefree state of affairs was about to come to an abrupt end as the date for the troops' departure drew closer. The port of Fremantle on the west coast of Australia became a major assembly point for thousands of Australian soldiers bound for the Western Front. This beautiful old city has remained virtually unchanged since the time when Jack marched through here. The troops were often mustered at the artillery barracks, where the parade ground echoed to the sounds of marching feet. The first battalions of the new Australian Imperial Force came through here, bound as they thought for the battlefields of Europe.
We're expecting to leave any moment for the old country. The transport ships and the warships are in Fremantle, waiting to take us away. I'm in the Australian Army Medical Corps, and my address when I get back to England will be Private Jack Simpson. I think we're going to Aldershot when we get to England, so I'll be able to come and see you pretty often before we go at the front.
On the quaysides, crowds came to wish them farewell. It was a joyful scene for the local people, perhaps a more sobering one for the troops as they pondered their fate. At this stage, no one knew quite what to expect. The war in France and Belgium was a long way away, and the men were concerned that it might all be over before they had a chance to fight. On the 1st of November 1914, Jack and his mates of C-section were marched out of Black Boy Hill Camp to board the appropriately named SS Medic. The ship was part of a convoy of 36 troop transports escorted by 4 cruisers of the Royal Australian Navy. At 6:25 on a beautiful morning, the fleet put to sea. Jack failed to write home while aboard. However, the tedium of the voyage was about to take a turn for the better in the most dramatic way. On the morning of the 9th of November, there was a commotion among the cruisers escorting the convoy. The German surface raider Emden had been sighted and the cruiser Sydney sent to intercept. At around 10 in the morning, the troops on board heard a distant rumbling, which many of them described as sounding like the beating of a big drum. Then, at 10:45, a wireless message came through reporting that the Sydney was briskly engaging the enemy and that the Emden was done for. To help celebrate the sinking, every man was given an extra beer ration.
The Emden is finally beached and done for. The Australians all go on deck to celebrate, but a ration of beer has been poured to help them celebrate. Simpson's the one man who doesn't go on deck. He drinks all the beer and they come back to find him as full as a boot, in the terms of one of his mates. They all enjoy the joke. This is the man Simpson was. He's the man who breaks into the rations on another boat and distributes all the food he can find to all the men. Many stories like this. He was an individual character and he was the larrikin. It's what gives him the legendary status to Australians.
Meanwhile, other forces were at work. While still at sea, the convoy was ordered to change course for Alexandria in Egypt. This decision was made following the disastrous consequences of billeting Canadian troops on Salisbury Plain during a British winter. Hundreds had suffered from exposure, casualties the Allies could ill afford to lose. To avoid a similar fate, the Australian and New Zealand troops would now complete their training in Egypt. On arrival, the men were sent to Maina Camp on the outskirts of Cairo.
We arrived in Cairo last week. We camped at the entrance to the desert. You can see nothing but sand, sand, sand. We'll have 2 pyramids about 300 yards from our tents. They're expecting the Turks to advance on Cairo. I wish they would hurry up and come, for everybody's getting impatient to have a brush up with the Turks.
It was about this time that the name Anzac came into being. To help with the administration of thousands of men who were now arriving in Egypt, an army clerk came up with the notion of using only the initials from Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and so the name was born.
Just a line to let you know that I'm still in Cairo. It's Christmas Day. I was looking forward to spending today in Shield, but I was doomed to be disappointed. I wouldn't have joined this contingent if I'd known that we weren't going to England. I would have taken a trip home and had a holiday, and then joined the army at home and went to the front instead of being stuck in this ungodly hole.
Jack and his mates would not have to wait much longer before seeing action. On the 2nd of January 1915, Russia asked the help of her allies Britain and France in the face of serious threats from the Turks. Lord Kitchener, the British Secretary of State for War, agreed to help make a demonstration against the Turks who, thanks to a catalogue of missed opportunities by Britain and her allies, had decided to come into the war on the German side. In 1915, the British War Cabinet included government ministers along with the generals and admirals of the armed forces. But it was Kitchener for the army and Churchill for the navy who ran the show. They were to dictate the strategy and the outcome of this campaign. The original plan called for a combined British and French battleship fleet to force its way through the Dardanelles, the 40-mile stretch of water that divides mainland Turkey from Europe. The battleships would bombard the fortified towns of Çanakkale and Kilidbar, which defend the narrowest part of the straits. They would then push on through to Constantinople, where it was hoped the arrival of the Allied fleet would cause the Turks to surrender. Churchill had also demanded that troops should be made available to support the navy, despite Kitchener's desire to keep as many as he could for service on the Western Front. In Cairo, things weren't going entirely to plan. The Anzacs were growing restive. Unruly behaviour became widespread among the troops. In January 1915, more than 300 men were missing from their posts. General Bridges would have to do something if his force was to remain effective. In February, he sent 131 of the worst offenders home in disgrace. Meanwhile, British officers observed the antics of the Aussies with some alarm.
Askance may be the right word for it. They were doubtful of them, and particularly when they saw what they considered was indiscipline. Saluting, for instance, was something which was very much considered infra-dig with Australians, whereas with the British it was created as a form of greeting between officer and man, and each was expected to acknowledge each other as a form of respect. In the Australian forces, that was another matter. They were different men that had developed a different ethos of living, of independence, of speaking out if they weren't happy with the situation. The British, on the other hand, were very much more stereotyped in their approach, basically perhaps at that time because of the officer and men relationship due to the class system which existed.
Kitchener was still preoccupied with setbacks on the Western Front and irritated by Churchill's demands for men to support the Dardanelles campaign, which was still considered a naval attack. Churchill declared to the War Council that he wanted it put officially on record that he would not take responsibility for any failure should insufficient troops be made available to support the Navy. Despite Kitchener's protests, he got his way, and the Anzacs would now join the Royal Naval Division and a French division already committed to the venture. On the 3rd of March, Jack and the rest of C Section boarded the transport ships and headed for the island of Lemnos, 60 miles from the Gallipoli Peninsula.
Just a line to let you know that we're leaving Egypt today. I don't know where we're bound for, but I hope it'll be England or France.
Lemnos would be the 3rd Field Ambulance's base for the next 7 weeks. On the 18th of March 1915, the Allied fleet steamed into the Dardanelles to begin its attack. Unfortunately, the operation didn't go as planned. The previous night, a Turkish mine layer had slipped out unseen to lay a series of mines which caught the huge ships unawares. 3 battleships were sunk and others damaged as the fleet exchanged gunfire with the Turkish shore batteries. Fearing further losses, the fleet retired. It was a defeat that meant troops would now have to be committed in a combined Navy and Army assault. The decision was finally taken to land troops on the Gallipoli Peninsula. This was planned for the 23rd of April, but bad weather caused it to be postponed till the 25th. On Lemnos, the Anzacs boarded their transports for the 60-mile journey to the peninsula. On the evening of the 24th, Jack and the 3rd Field Ambulance were transferred to the destroyer Ribble and set out for the enemy coast. 2 days earlier, Jack had written his last letter home.
Dear Mother, just a line to let you know that I'm still keeping well. I can't tell you where we are for the censor would cross it out, but you will be hearing about the Australians as soon as we make a start. Hope this letter will find you and Annie well, as it leaves me at present.
The plan was for the Anzacs to be put ashore as a single force.
Well, the original intention with the Australian troops was to send them out piecemeal into British units to give them experience. But General Bridges, the commander of the Australian division, would have none of it, and probably quite rightly. And he determined that the Australians would only fight as a unit. And when they went to Gallipoli, that was the condition on which the New Zealanders and the Australians would undertake the operation. Therefore, it was common sense to put them all together in one particular facet of the campaign. And for that reason, they were chosen to go to Anzac and to be north of the British attack, some 8 miles, and to cut across the peninsula, to cut off any possibility of Turkish troops coming down from the north to reinforce the Turkish troops who hopefully by then had been cut off. That was the basic concept, and probably the right one, I think, in all circumstances.
So much for the plan. In reality, things got off to a bad start. As the Anzacs reached the shore, they soon realised that they'd been landed at the wrong place, not at the beach at Gaba Tepe, but about a mile further north. This failure was later blamed on an error of navigation by the Navy. At 4:30, the first of the rowing boats carrying the men reached the beach. They were already taking casualties from a hail of bullets as the defending Turks opened fire. The beach, which would later become known as Anzac Cove, was only 20 yards wide, with steep hills and cliffs rising almost sheer from the sea. The Anzacs began to scramble their way up, still taking casualties from enemy fire. Jack was landed soon after the first wave, coming ashore almost 300 yards north of Arrybranu Point, opposite a rocky outcrop the troops called the Sphinx. He was the second man out of his boat, managing to make the shore. The man in front and the one following were immediately hit. During the landing, the 3rd Field Ambulance lost 3 men killed and another 14 wounded. The fighting which now took place as the Anzacs strove to reach the higher ground was desperate, as the men fought their way through the dense undergrowth under enemy fire. This became the pattern of fighting at Anzac during the first days. The Turks reacted to the landing by sending more troops, led by the only truly great general on either side to emerge from the campaign, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, commander of the 19th Turkish Division. Under the command of this inspired leader, the Turks pushed as many men as they could into the line in an attempt to stall the invaders. Kemal would go on to be acknowledged by the Turks as the saviour of Gallipoli and ultimately president of the Turkish Republic. In the face of this strengthening opposition, the Anzacs continued to take increasing numbers of casualties. Jack and the 3rd Field Ambulance had instructions to serve the 3rd Brigade, who were struggling to hold the Turks on the left flank and were being pushed back towards the sea. The stretcher bearers were in the thick of it, carrying wounded back from the front line to the beach for evacuation. The bearers took some of the boats still lining the shore and rowed the wounded off, while the rest made their way along the beach to Anzac Cove, where they set up their headquarters. The landscape at Anzac on the 25th of April was similar to the way it looks today. The troops were faced with almost impenetrable undergrowth and a series of razorback ridges, all but impossible to climb. The fighting between the Anzacs and the Turks was bloody and brutal. Hundreds lay dead or badly wounded as attack and counter-attack raged, both sides striving to take and keep the higher ground. Fighting at the hill known as Baby 700 resulted in appalling casualties. Successive attacks by the Anzacs were pushed back by Kemal and his men, who fought with fanatical determination. Possession of the hill changed hands 5 times during the course of the day. The stretcher bearers were in the thick of the fighting. Jack and his mates in C-section were kept busy tending the wounded, sometimes only yards from where the troops were fighting. They then had to carry the injured all the way back to the beach. Major Corbin, second in command of the casualty clearing station at Anzac Cove, recalled the horrors of the first day. We landed at 10:30 and found plenty of work. The beach a tangled mass of men. Wounded are pouring in, no chance of getting them off. These are being dressed and put on the beach, hundreds and hundreds of them, dying, dead and badly wounded. The ships are bombarding from the sea and the noise is deafening. We hear the losses are terrific, no time for fear, much too busy. By midday, 2 hospital ships were filled with wounded and had set off back to Alexandria. Barges were being used to ferry them out, and they were soon crammed with badly wounded men. More than 2,000 casualties were sustained on the first day. 8 days later, the total had risen to 8,500, 2,300 of them dead. There was now a serious shortage of stretchers. Many of the wounded were so badly hurt that when they reached the aid station, the medical orderlies were often afraid to lift them off, fearing they might cause more injury. The bearers had been trained to use 4-man stretcher squads, but in this kind of terrain, under constant rifle and machine gun fire, it proved impossible. Even 2 men carrying a wounded soldier experienced real difficulty. Many of the stretcher bearers found that the best way to carry a man was over your shoulder. On the morning of the 26th, Jack was doing just that. Then he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Several donkeys had come ashore to help haul supplies. Some had broken free and were wandering around the gullies looking for food. Jack, responding to a call for stretcher bearers, found one of the donkeys grazing near to where the wounded man lay. He helped the soldier onto the little animal and started to lead him back to the beach. So the legend of the man with the donkey was born. It was miraculous that he made the trip unscathed, as the air around him shrieked with the sounds of bullets and shrapnel. For the next 24 days, Jack made the perilous journey up and down shrapnel and Monash gullies, defying any known laws of survival. His reaction to advice from many of the soldiers to take cover was ignored, and his well-known reply was simply, "My troubles." This is Shrapnel Gully, where Simpson and his donkey plied their dangerous trade. His day would begin around 6 o'clock in the morning, down at the beach. He'd get up, go to a nearby water station and have his breakfast. After that, he'd start the 1.5 mile trek up towards the front line. He made the journey about 12, 15 times each and every day. Often he wouldn't finish until 2 or 3 o'clock the following morning. Along the route, he was constantly exposed to enemy fire, snipers and machine gunners from the ridges around the valley. And of course, there was always the shrapnel, which gave this once terrible place its name. The writer E.C. Bully interviewed many men who had served on Anzac and remembers that no Australasian ever speaks of him without saying he earned the VC a dozen times. The man seemed to know by intuition every twist and slope of the tortuous valleys. The donkey was a patient, sure-footed ally. Some days they would bring as many as 12 or 15 men. On every trip they faced the terrors of the Valley of Death. All day and all night the air sang with the bullets from the Turkish snipers hidden on Dead Man's Ridge. When the fire down the valley was at its worst and orders were posted that the ambulance men must not go out, the man and his donkey continued at their work. At times they held trenches of hundreds of men, spellbound. This unique photograph shows Jack in action, bringing one of the wounded back down Shrapnel Gully. In the chaos that was Anzac, Jack was making these trips under his own initiative, carrying twice as many wounded as conventional bearer parties. Technically, he was a deserter, leaving his post to do as he saw fit, yet it was clear that this was one breach of military discipline that seemed to be working. His commanding officer, Colonel Sutton, not only sanctioned what he was doing, but encouraged him. Following his first day bringing the wounded down on the donkey, Jack failed to report back to the ambulance headquarters on the beach. He'd set up camp with Indian soldiers of the 1st Kohat Mountain Artillery Battery who had their base in Shrapnel Gully. These troops kept a number of mules which were used to haul the guns. They also had supplies of fodder. Jack made friends with the Indians and set up camp. It was to prove a mutually agreeable situation as the gunners warmed to their newfound companion. They came to know Jack and what he was doing. It is said they idolised him, calling him Bahadur, or bravest of the brave. James Jackson of the 3rd Field Ambulance recalled that he warned Jack about not rejoining his unit when ordered to which he replied, "To hell with them. The old donk and I can do as much work as 4 men. Each day, Jack would pass his fellow stretcher bearers going into Shrapnel and Monash gullies on their way to the front line, and each day it was recorded that he was absent from his unit. Had he been in the British Army, he could have been charged with desertion and most likely shot by firing squad. During the First World War, the British executed 346 of their own soldiers, 3 of them on Gallipoli. It was a condition of Australia's participation in the war that none of her soldiers would suffer such a fate. Colonel Sutton, Jack's commander, regarded him as an exceptional case, requiring only that he should report regularly to be recorded on the unit roll. The majority of the men now in action at Anzac were volunteers. They saw themselves as a citizens' army and wouldn't tolerate the strictures that applied to British soldiers. This rebellious larrikin spirit was embodied in Jack, in common with many of the men at Anzac. The brutality of the fighting during the first weeks has become the stuff of legend. Huge casualties were sustained by both sides as the Turks fought desperately in their attempts to push the Anzacs back into the sea. Many of the men were driven almost mad with bloodlust, having seen so many of their mates killed. This industrial-scale killing was something different, even for the most battle-crazed men. What they were doing went beyond anything that they might have expected or been trained for.
The sound of firing never ceased. At one stage, Monash, the commander of the 4th Brigade, wrote to his wife that a few of the officers had been sitting around at night trying to work out how long there had been at any time between the sound of firing. Somebody said 15 seconds, but none of the men believed him, Monash wrote. He said they eventually agreed that it would be about 11 seconds, was the longest any of them had ever counted between the sounds of firing. And that was day and night. Simpson and his field ambulance mates were working all day and much of the night to gather in wounded men. So there was the strain and the tiredness, the constant death, the sight and sounds of blood in this landscape of spring on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which was extremely beautiful, with wildflowers everywhere. Some men later said that the mixed smell of the blood and the thyme, wild thyme and rosemary, was such that they could never stand the smell of rosemary or thyme again later in their peaceful life.
Jack's route to the front line through Shrapnel Gully and Monash Gully took him to the firing line on the crest of the ridge. The positions at Quinn's, Courtney's and Steele's posts were the most dangerous places on Anzac. The opposing trenches were only a few yards apart. When Simpson set out up Shrapnel Gully, this is where he was heading for, the front line. It's where the fighting was at its most ferocious. The enemy trenches were only about 15 yards away, and the Turks could hear the Aussies talking, could even smell their food cooking. Now, when Simpson got up here, he'd leave the donkey under cover and often have to scrabble out across no man's land to where the wounded lay and drag them back to where the donkey was, often under intense enemy fire. Once there, he'd put the wounded man on the donkey and they'd head back down Shrapnel Gully to the dressing station, which was at the beach. During May, the Turks launched a series of ferocious assaults in an attempt to push the Anzacs off the ridge. On the 15th, Major General Bridges set off up Monash Gully to see things for himself. Camouflaged Turkish snipers were still a major problem, and the general was warned about the danger. But he was determined to set the right kind of example. Running between the barricades, he was mortally wounded and died 4 days later. On that day, at almost the same spot, Jack's luck finally ran out. May the 19th was the bloodiest day of the campaign for the Turks. They committed 30,000 troops to the attack aimed at Quinn's and Courtney's posts. At 3:30 in the morning, they advanced. Visibility that morning was particularly good, giving the Aussies a clear view as the Turks attacked in the half light. They pushed forward in massed rows, offering easy targets for the defenders. More than 10,000 fell as the Anzacs fought each other for a place on the fire step. As the sounds of battle raged above him, Jack was making his way up Monash Valley to help with the wounded at Courtney's, where the fighting had been particularly fierce. He collected a wounded soldier and was about to make his way back down when, to his amazement and that of the surrounding troops, they heard the sound of a brass band. It was coming from the direction of the Turkish trenches, where they were playing their men into action. Jack then began his journey back down the valley, with the sounds of the battle and the band ringing in his ears. As he neared the spot where General Bridges had been shot a few days before, someone shouted out that there was a Turkish machine gun. Whether he heard the shout isn't known. At that moment, the gun opened up and Jack fell forward, shot through the back. He was probably dead before he hit the ground. His body was later brought down the valley and buried at Hell's Spit, now the site of Beach Cemetery. It's a feature of the British and Commonwealth cemeteries on Gallipoli that headstones are only placed where a soldier is known to be buried. Today, Jack lies where he was originally laid to rest, his grave now an essential part of any Australian's visit to Gallipoli. On the 15th of June, his mother and sister, distraught at the news of the casualty lists from the Dardanelles, wrote imploring him to write home.
I just thought I would write you a few lines to try and cheer you up. Oh, if only this terrible war was finished, for it seems dreadful to think that so many fine, healthy young men have to be used as fodder for the guns. Mother and I have sent you a box of 50 woodbines, so I hope you get them all right. Mother is keeping a bit better just now, but of course you are ever in her thoughts and she can't be happy. I only wish I knew for certain that you were just as well. With love to you from Mother and myself, and praying for your safe return home again.
The letter was returned unopened, with the single word "killed" written starkly on the envelope. Today the landscape at Anzac remains very much as it was in 1915. The ridges and gullies still show signs of the now distant conflict. For many, this has become a place of pilgrimage, a place to come and see what it was that men had to endure in the name of lost enterprise. Disastrous failure though it was, the Gallipoli campaign has played a central role in the formation of the Australian national character. The Anzac spirit is now an acknowledged part of Australia's psyche, reflected by the number of people who come to pay homage here every 25th of April. This year, the dawn service attracted a record number of visitors. More than 15,000 came to remember the war dead.
All of them are with us in spirit at this special time. The Anzac spirit of friendship that binds us together.
It's an awe-inspiring sight to watch the sunrise at Anzac. For Australians, this is a powerful place to be on this particular day. The scenes that were acted out here seem but a small slip of time away. More than 7,000 Australians died here, holding on to a bite-sized chunk of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Turkish people have remained generous in their remembrance of Anzac, echoing the mutual respect that was eventually experienced by the opposing troops. Casualties during the campaign were enormous. The Turks lost 87,000 dead, the British 25,000, the French almost 10,000, the Australians 7,300 and the New Zealanders 2,400. While the dawn service remembers the tragedy at Anzac, the service later in the day at Lone Pine is more of a celebration. This is where the Aussies attacked the well-defended Turkish trenches on the 6th of August. The casualties were horrific, with the bitter hand-to-hand fighting lasting for 4 days. 6 VCs were won at Lone Pine. In all, Australians won 8 VCs during the campaign. John Simpson Kirkpatrick wasn't to be one of them.
I mean, he is somebody who is understandably and appropriately acclaimed as a man who showed enormous courage. It's not as though he was, just wandering through the hills without there being any enemy fire. I think what's surprising is he hasn't been given a medal posthumously. I'm not sure of the explanation for that.
A bill to award him a posthumous VC is still before the Australian Parliament. Attempts to debase the legend of the man with the donkey have also caused controversy among historians. The revisionist schools say that he was a man who jumped ship twice and who subsequently disobeyed orders by remaining away from his post, and that the legend was adopted by the state as a means of raising more recruits.
His myth was appropriated, the story of this man who only lasted 24 days and who brought down wounded men, and the myth had a great power to it. There was also an anti-myth that arose around the same time amongst the soldiers and was promoted later, that he was a boozer, a brawler, a British deserter who'd used the donkey as a bit of a lazy dodge to avoid having to carry men. But at the same time, the myth was promoted back home. It was used for conscription purposes, and as one historian wrote, Simpson was busy in those 24 days and rescued, possibly if you accept the higher figures, up to 300 men, 300 wounded men. But he was never more busy than after his death, when his legend grew and it was appropriated for the forces of conscription and for promoting Australia's involvement in the war. And the truth is still there for people to find. He's a character who belongs as much to Britain as he does to Australia in many ways. We've appropriated him as an Anzac. In fact, one of our historians, Patsy Adam-Smith, wrote that he was a hero, as redolent as a gum tree, as Australian as a kangaroo, a true colonial figure. Well, he was that, but he was also a Geordie.
He wasn't the only South Shields man who was killed at Gallipoli. A lot of local men joined the Royal Naval Division during the First World War, and units of the Royal Naval Division were decimated at Gallipoli. So the Kirkpatricks weren't the only family who were left grieving. He also left the area, you have to remember, when he was still only in his teens. And I think at the time, and for quite a few years afterwards, what he'd actually done at Gallipoli wasn't appreciated, wasn't known by the people here. And by the time it was, he'd already been, as it were, appropriated by the Australian people as virtually an adopted Australian, and was no longer identified with this country.
What does appear clear is that the extraordinary situation at Anzac demanded extraordinary measures and extraordinary men. Regardless of conflicting opinion, there can be no doubt that Simpson Kirkpatrick was different. Jack was a character, forever the larrikin, an everyman for the Australian nation.